The Concorde glided smoothly through the sky, its sleek body cutting through the clouds like a knife. Inside, the passengers settled into the quiet rhythm of the flight, unaware that within the next few hours, one among them would lie dead. A scream would pierce the calm, a diamond would disappear, and Hercule Poirot, as always, would be the one to uncover the truth. But who among them harbored the dark secret that would turn this flight into a twisted game of deception and murder? Chapter 1. The calm before the storm. The Concorde glided smoothly through the cloudless sky, its engines humming with a quiet power. It was an airliner that exuded wealth and refinement, and Hercule Poirot, ever the observer, sat in the plush seat of his private compartment, his legs neatly crossed, his hands folded on his lap. He looked out the small window beside him, watching the sky stretch out endlessly in every direction. The sun's golden light bathed the world below in a serene glow, casting a tranquil spell over the passengers within. He had been aboard the Crossland Airways Concorde for nearly an hour now, on a direct flight from London to New York. The plane was a marvel of modern technology, a testament to human ingenuity, and yet, to Poirot, the true fascination was always with the people aboard. For as much as he loved order and structure, he understood the chaos that lay within human nature. His sharp eyes and mind were always scanning, cataloguing and analyzing. It was his nature. As the flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, Poirot's eyes flickered over each face, each figure that passed. He was not interested in their luggage, nor their seats, nor their minor inconveniences. It was their behavior, the subtle gestures and inflections in their voices, the way they held themselves. These were the details that always intrigued him. The human puzzle. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned back in his seat, noticing that his companion for the journey, a nervous young man with dark circles under his eyes, was seated 2 rows ahead. But the man seemed harmless enough. Poirot wasn't concerned. The real interest, as always, lay elsewhere. A soft knock came at his door, and the flight attendant entered, her smile warm but professional. "Mr. Poirot, I trust you're enjoying your flight." "Indeed, mademoiselle," he replied in his precise melodic voice. "A smooth journey so far, and I am most pleased." "I'm glad to hear that. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to let us know." She paused, her gaze flickering briefly toward the compartment of a man seated at the front. Poirot caught the subtle shift in her expression. "Is there something troubling you, mademoiselle?" he inquired, ever the perceptive observer. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Nothing at all, Mr. Poirot. Just business. I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your flight." She bowed slightly and exited. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Business. He filed away the exchange but chose not to dwell on it. There were far more interesting things unfolding. His gaze turned toward the passengers in the adjacent compartments. Among them were several he'd already observed, all with their own little quirks and idiosyncrasies. The first to catch his eye was Hilda Burnett, a middle-aged woman with a dignified air and an unsettling sense of detachment. She was seated beside her husband, Richard Burnett, a man whose hands trembled ever so slightly as he fidgeted with a leather briefcase. His face, though refined, held an undercurrent of anxiety that was not entirely masked by the polished exterior he presented to the world. Hilda leaned in close to Richard, her voice a low murmur. Poirot couldn't hear their conversation, but he caught the way Richard's eyes darted around nervously, as though something beyond the conversation, something unseen, was weighing heavily on him. Next, there was Marcus Byrne, a man who appeared completely at ease in the luxury of the Concorde. Byrne was in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with greying hair that was neatly combed back. He exuded an aura of power and self-assurance, the kind of man who had long grown accustomed to getting what he wanted. Yet there was something about his easy smile, the way his eyes lingered a moment too long on certain passengers, that Poirot found unsettling. Byrne had been talking animatedly with a few people earlier, and though he was charismatic, there was a certain coldness in his demeanour, an edge of calculation that Poirot found intriguing. Lastly, there was the woman who had caught Poirot's attention earlier, the young, nervous woman seated near the back of the plane, wearing an expensive but slightly frayed coat. Her name was Vivienne Cole, a socialite travelling alone. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as though she was expecting someone, or perhaps fleeing from something. Her hand rested constantly on the small purse at her side, as though she were guarding it. She looked around the cabin with wide, anxious eyes, as though she expected the worst. Poirot knew that look. It was the look of someone with a secret. It wasn't long before Poirot overheard a conversation between Vivienne Cole and Marcus Byrne. Their voices were low, but Poirot, with his acute hearing, caught snippets of their exchange. "I told you, Vivienne," Byrne's voice rumbled with that characteristic coolness. "The deal is set. You have no need to worry about the diamond." "It's already arranged," Vivienne's voice trembled slightly. "But what if something goes wrong? What if someone knows?" "Nothing will go wrong, my dear," Byrne replied, his voice a bit too smooth, too rehearsed. "The Star of Carthage will be delivered safely. Trust me." Poirot's mind whirred. The Star of Carthage. The diamond had been the subject of much speculation among the passengers. It was an extraordinary piece, said to have been lost for centuries before recently resurfacing in the hands of a wealthy collector. It had been confirmed that the diamond was being transported aboard the flight in the plane's secure cargo hold. To the untrained eye, it seemed like just another luxury item, valuable, but not worth the frenzy it had sparked among certain circles. But Poirot was well aware that certain treasures held far more value than their monetary worth. His curiosity piqued. Poirot listened carefully as Byrne's conversation with Vivienne continued. He couldn't help but notice the tension between them, the thinly veiled fear in Vivienne's voice. He made a mental note to keep an eye on these two. And then, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A brief glance caught Richard Burnett, who was standing now, his hand gripping the back of his seat. His eyes were fixated on the door of the plane's secure cargo hold, which led directly to the vault containing the Star of Carthage. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Poirot's gaze remained steady as he observed Burnett, trying to read the man's thoughts. There was something about Burnett's fixation on the vault that suggested more than mere curiosity. Poirot's mind clicked into gear, and he mentally filed away the peculiarities of the man's behaviour. But just as Poirot's thoughts were beginning to swirl, a shriek split the air, a sound that jolted him from his observations. It was a scream of pure terror, followed by an immediate unsettling silence that hung over the cabin. A muffled voice, panicked and barely coherent, shouted, Someone's been murdered." The calm, uneventful flight had turned into something far darker. Poirot's sharp mind immediately shifted from idle curiosity to focused investigation. He stood up, adjusting his coat with an air of quiet authority. This was his moment, the moment he'd been waiting for. For he knew, as surely as the plane cut through the sky, that the events of this flight had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 2. A death at 40,000 feet. The plane seemed to still, a moment of disbelief hanging in the air as the passengers absorbed the piercing scream. There was a stunned silence before the chaos began. It wasn't just the scream that rattled the passengers. It was the palpable sense that something had gone terribly wrong. A murder. In the sky, of all places. Hercule Poirot was already on his feet. his hand adjusting his tie as he made his way toward the source of the disturbance. His sharp eyes scanned the cabin, and his calm demeanor cut through the mounting panic. The flight attendants were already gathered near the back of the plane, but it was clear they were equally bewildered. One of them, a young woman with trembling hands, was the first to speak as Poirot approached. "Mr. Poirot, it's Mr. Fisher," she stammered, her face pale. "He's been stabbed." Poirot's gaze hardened, though his tone remained unruffled. "Stabbed, you say? Where?" "Near the rear of the plane. He's dead." Poirot nodded without speaking. His mind was already racing, calculating the next steps. He moved past the crew with swift, confident strides, reaching the scene of the crime with remarkable ease. The body was sprawled across 2 seats near the back of the plane, the victim's face frozen in a grimace of shock. Gordon Fisher, the wealthy banker whose name had come up in conversation earlier, was dead. He was a man in his late 50s, well-groomed and wearing a sharp suit, someone who could have been considered a pillar of society, if not for the twisted mystery now surrounding him. The small knife, a sleek silver pen knife, was embedded deep into his chest, but strangely, there was very little blood staining his clothing. Poirot knelt beside the body, inspecting it with clinical precision. His sharp eyes missed nothing. Fisher's face was pale, and his eyes were wide open, as though his final moments had been filled with pure terror. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of any defensive wounds. The only oddity was that his clothes were disturbingly clean. In a crime of this nature, blood would usually be a giveaway, but here it seemed controlled. "Did anyone touch the body?" Poirot asked quietly, his gaze still fixed on Fisher. "No," replied one of the flight attendants, her voice strained. "No one had a chance. We heard the scream, and then we ran." Poirot looked up at the gathered passengers, who were watching from a distance. They were all standing near the front of the cabin, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and fear. The flight attendants were keeping a distance, ensuring no one touched anything, but Poirot could sense the rising panic in the air. The calm, professional atmosphere of the flight had disintegrated into something darker. "Lock the doors," Poirot instructed firmly. "No one is to leave this cabin. No one," his command echoed in the tense air, and the attendants immediately complied, locking the cockpit and cabin doors with a precision born of professional discipline. The sound of the lock clicking shut seemed almost final. Poirot stood and surveyed the cabin again, his mind already putting together the pieces of the puzzle. His gaze fell on Marcus Byrne, who was standing toward the back of the group, a small frown of unease on his face. His usual confident demeanor had faltered, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible twitch in his right hand. Then, Poirot turned his attention to Hilda Burnett and her husband Richard. Hilda was standing with her arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed ahead, but her face was pale. Richard, on the other hand, had both hands on his head, as though trying to steady himself. His knuckles were white, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Poirot knew there was something more to Richard's anxious behavior than mere surprise. But it was Vivian Cole who caught his attention next. She was seated in her row, clutching her purse with white knuckles, her eyes wide and unfocused. She was trembling slightly, and her lips were parted, but there was no sound, just the quiet whimpering of someone on the edge of hysteria. The woman was clearly rattled, but Poirot wondered if her reaction was genuine or merely a well-executed act. With deliberate calm, Poirot stepped toward the front of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice soft but commanding, "I must ask you all to remain seated. I will need to speak with each of you shortly." He turned back toward the crew, who were now standing by, eager for instructions. "One of you," he said, "go to the cockpit and inform the captain of what has happened. We must ensure that no one leaves this aircraft, as I believe we have a murderer among us." As the flight attendants scrambled into action, Poirot's mind worked quickly, processing each detail, each tiny clue that had already presented itself. It was not only the murder that intrigued him, it was the way each passenger had reacted. The flight was a confined space, and the killer was, without a doubt, one of the people aboard. The question was not who had committed the crime. It was how and why. Poirot's first thought was the Star of Carthage diamond, the valuable treasure that had been mentioned earlier. He knew the diamond was being transported in the plane's cargo hold, and the timing of the murder was too perfect to be a coincidence. Was this crime about wealth, a greedy attempt to seize the diamond? Or was there a deeper motivation at play, something more personal, more hidden? He glanced back at the passengers, his gaze lingering on Byrne, then moving to Richard Burnett, who was visibly trying to compose himself. And then there was Vivienne, her eyes flickering nervously toward the door of the plane's secure cargo hold, though she quickly looked away when she realized Poirot was watching. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and a young flight attendant entered, her eyes wide with panic. "The captain wants to know if you'll need him to initiate a full lockdown. He said he can make an emergency landing at the nearest airport." Poirot turned to the young woman. "No, mademoiselle, we will not make an emergency landing just yet. We will finish our investigation. But first, I must ask you all to remain calm. This will not be easy, but we will find the truth." With that, he turned back to the body, inspecting it one final time. There was something else about the victim, a detail that hadn't registered at first. The subtle scent of cologne, rich and masculine, clung to the air around Fisher's body. A perfume. But which one? That was a question for later. As Poirot rose to speak once more, he knew this was only the beginning. The puzzle was just starting to take shape, and it would be up to him to solve it before the flight reached its destination. The stakes were higher than ever, and the murderer was still on board. Chapter 3. A Web of Motives. The cabin of the Crosland Airways Concorde felt smaller now, more suffocating. It wasn't just the enclosed space that made the air thick with tension, but the knowledge that one among them was a murderer. Each passenger had retreated into themselves, their faces masks of shock or fear. Yet, behind the expressions of confusion, Poirot knew that there were hidden motives, and he was determined to uncover them. The flight attendants had secured the area, ensuring that no one left their seat, while the cockpit remained under lock and key. The plane continued its journey, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within its confines. Poirot stood near the body, making mental notes as the other passengers whispered amongst themselves. He motioned to one of the attendants. "Bring the passengers to me. One by one, we shall begin the interrogation." It was methodical, as always. Poirot knew better than to rush through this process. He had learned from experience that each person's reaction, no matter how small, held a key to unraveling the truth. First, Poirot approached Richard Burnett. Richard had been seated just a few rows away from the body and had been one of the first to react with shock. He was now seated, his hands still tightly gripping the armrests of his seat. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and genuine distress. "Richard Burnett," Poirot began softly, standing just a few feet away. "You were one of the first to express concern when the body was discovered. You seemed quite unsettled. Can you tell me why?" Richard's eyes darted nervously. I didn't know the man very well. He was a colleague of mine, but I didn't think anyone would want to harm him. He was well liked. He was... Poirot raised an eyebrow, carefully choosing his next words. Yes, he was well liked, you say. And yet, you seemed startled, almost too startled. You've been sweating since the moment you heard of his death, Mr. Burnett. Tell me, did you have a conflict with Mr. Fisher? Richard shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under Poirot's piercing gaze. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Conflict? No, not at all. We did have disagreements about business, but nothing serious. Nothing that could have led to... This Poirot nodded slowly. What business were you and Mr. Fisher involved in? Please, elaborate. Richard hesitated. It's complicated. We were both in the financial sector, investments, mergers, that sort of thing. We had a falling out over some risky dealings he was involved in. He wanted to take some chances that I didn't approve of, but... Richard trailed off, his voice tight. But that's all. We didn't argue. Not like that Poirot studied Richard's face, but there was something he wasn't saying, something lingering beneath the surface. The man's body language, his clenched fists, his shallow breathing, spoke of deeper turmoil. But Poirot didn't press him further, at least not yet. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes never leaving Richard's. You'll remain here for now, Mr. Burnett. I will return shortly. Richard nodded, though his expression had become even more drawn, if that was possible. Next, Poirot approached Hilda Burnett. Hilda had been sitting quietly ever since the murder had been discovered. Her expression was stoic, though her eyes flickered uneasily as Poirot approached. She was a woman in her mid-50s, tall and regal, with a reserved elegance about her that seemed almost out of place amidst the current chaos. Mademoiselle Burnett, Poirot greeted her, his voice calm but insistent. I must ask you a few questions. She smiled thinly but said nothing. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. There is a certain air of tension between you and your husband, is there not? You appear more composed than Mr. Burnett, but your eyes betray a certain unease. Poirot's gaze never wavered. I assure you, Mr. Poirot, that I'm simply in shock, Hilda replied coolly. It's hard to believe that someone would kill him. Mr. Fisher was, well, a business acquaintance. We didn't know him well. Poirot raised an eyebrow. You are quite calm, mademoiselle. Too calm, I think, given the circumstances. Tell me, did you and Mr. Fisher ever meet outside of business? Hilda's eyes flickered for just a moment before she quickly masked the reaction. No, not at all. Poirot leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Are you sure about that, mademoiselle? I have reason to believe that you once had an affair with Mr. Fisher. Hilda stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked at Poirot, and for a moment the facade of composure crumbled. That's not true, she snapped, but Poirot could see the colour rising in her cheeks. We had a professional relationship, nothing more. What my husband thinks, what anyone thinks, doesn't matter. Poirot held her gaze. You can deny it all you wish, but I know the truth. Affairs, especially when they're buried deep in the past, leave scars. Perhaps this is one of them. Hilda's breathing quickened. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't need to answer these questions, she said sharply, her voice trembling. I'm a victim too, Mr. Poirot. I'm married to a man whose life has just been turned upside down. Poirot observed her, noting the nervous energy beneath her outburst. Very well, mademoiselle. I will leave you for now, but know this. Everyone is a suspect until proven otherwise. She huffed, but said nothing more as Poirot turned and walked toward the next person in line. Finally, Poirot turned his attention to Marcus Byrne. Byrne had been standing near the back of the cabin, his arms folded across his broad chest, a slight frown on his face. Unlike the others, he hadn't seemed overly shocked by the murder. His calm demeanour made Poirot suspicious from the start. "Mr. Byrne," Poirot addressed him, his voice deliberately composed. "I must ask you a few questions, if I may." Byrne looked up, his sharp eyes meeting Poirot's. "Of course, Poirot," he said smoothly, his tone polite but distant. "What can I do for you?" "Tell me, Mr. Byrne," Poirot began, watching him closely. "You were speaking to Mademoiselle Cole earlier, were you not? You seemed rather familiar with her. What was your conversation about?" Byrne's expression didn't change. "Just business, Poirot. As you know, I deal in investments. She had a few questions about some deals I've been involved in. That's all." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Business? But the tone of your voice, the manner in which you spoke, there was something more to it, wasn't there? You were discussing the Star of Carthage, perhaps?" Byrne's eyes flickered for a moment, just a brief flash, but it was enough. Poirot knew he'd struck a nerve. "The diamond is of no concern to me," Byrne replied smoothly. "I was merely helping her with some inquiries." Poirot wasn't convinced. "I see. You weren't concerned about the theft. After all, it's been confirmed that the Star of Carthage was aboard this flight. Surely you're aware of the value of such an item?" Byrne gave a slight shrug. "Of course. But what does that have to do with the murder? Or with me?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Everything, Mr. Byrne. You see, it all connects. The murder, the diamond, the secrets each of you are trying so hard to keep hidden. It's all a puzzle waiting to be solved." Byrne's smile didn't falter, but Poirot saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so, Poirot?" Byrne replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Well, I'll leave you to your puzzle then." As Poirot moved away from Byrne, his thoughts were already racing. The web of motives was becoming clearer, but the threads were still tangled. He had only scratched the surface. There was more to this than met the eye, and Poirot knew he had to dig deeper. Each of these passengers had something to hide, and it was only a matter of time before their secrets came to light. But as he turned his attention to the rest of the passengers, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Whoever had murdered Gordon Fisher had done so with careful planning, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. The web was closing in, and Poirot was ready to unravel it. Chapter 4. The Disappearing Diamond. The aircraft hummed steadily through the sky, its sleek body slicing through the clouds, unperturbed by the chaos that had erupted inside. But within the cabin of the Crosland Airways Concorde, an invisible storm raged. Hercule Poirot stood in the midst of it, carefully observing every passenger, every detail, and every shift in behavior. The murder of Gordon Fisher was just the beginning, a beginning that was inextricably linked to a missing jewel, the legendary Star of Carthage. The missing diamond was no mere piece of jewellery. Rumoured to be worth millions, the Star of Carthage had been lost for centuries before resurfacing in a rare auction earlier that year. It was believed to be in the plane's secure cargo hold, safely locked away. Yet, as Poirot had discovered in the last few hours, nothing was as simple as it seemed. There were more layers to this story, layers that involved money, power, greed, and now a murder. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. "Mr. Poirot," the young flight attendant said, stepping into the compartment. "We've secured the cargo hold, but we have a problem." "What is it?" Poirot asked, his voice low but firm. "The diamond. It's gone." The words hit Poirot like a punch to the gut. He stood still for a moment, processing the information. The theft of the Star of Carthage was no coincidence. Whoever had murdered Fisher had also taken the diamond. The two events were linked, and Poirot knew that unraveling the truth would require more than just an investigation. It would require a full understanding of who stood to gain from both the murder and the theft. Poirot turned to the attendant, his expression calm yet resolute. "Secure the cabin. No one leaves. Inform the captain that the Star of Carthage is missing and that we are not proceeding until further investigation." The attendant nodded and left the compartment. Poirot stepped into the aisle, his eyes scanning the passengers as they sat frozen in their seats, whispers circulating between them. The plane had descended into a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a nervous cough or the rustle of clothes. Poirot's sharp eyes fell on Marcus Byrne, who was seated near the rear of the cabin, his face an unreadable mask. Poirot walked over to Byrne, his footsteps deliberately slow, each one measured. Byrne didn't look up as Poirot approached, but there was something about the set of his shoulders that told Poirot the man knew the diamond was gone. "Mr. Byrne," Poirot began, standing before him, "I trust you are aware of the situation." Byrne looked up, his cool blue eyes meeting Poirot's with an intensity that seemed to cut right through him. "Of course, Poirot. I've heard the news." His voice was smooth, calm, but Poirot caught the slight tightness in his jaw. "You think I took it, don't you?" "I think," Poirot said, his voice measured, "that we are all suspects. But you, Mr. Byrne, you are most certainly involved. Tell me, how do you know so much about the Star of Carthage?" Byrne's lips curled into a tight smile. "I have many contacts in the art world, Poirot. I knew about the diamond before it was ever put up for auction. I know how valuable it is. Why else would it be traveling on a flight like this one?" Poirot's gaze never wavered. "And yet, you were one of the first to speak to Mademoiselle Cole about it, weren't you?" Byrne's smile faltered for a brief second, but then he leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "You're very observant, Poirot. But I don't have to explain myself to you." "No, you do not," Poirot replied softly, "but perhaps you should. You see, I believe you were aware that the diamond was being transported aboard this plane, and that Fisher was the one handling it. That's why you were so eager to strike up a conversation with Mademoiselle Cole, because you knew she was also involved in the dealings surrounding the diamond." Byrne's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Poirot saw a shadow pass over his face. It was gone in an instant, but it had been enough. Poirot knew now that Byrne's cool exterior was masking something far deeper. "I had nothing to do with the murder," Byrne said, his voice flat, "and I certainly had no part in taking the diamond. As I told you, Poirot, I deal in investments, not petty thefts." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "You're lying, Mr. Byrne. You're too calm. The murder, the missing diamond, everything points to you. But I will not accuse you without proof. However, I suggest you remain here for the time being. The truth will come out soon enough." Byrne's lips tightened, but he said nothing more. Poirot turned away from him, his mind already calculating his next move. The theft of the Star of Carthage had not only complicated the investigation, it had deepened the mystery. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Vivienne Cole. Vivienne had been sitting at the back of the plane, her face pale, her hands still gripping her purse with an almost desperate intensity. She'd been speaking with Byrne earlier, and Poirot had already noted the strange connection between the two. Her nervousness was palpable, and her unease was something Poirot could no longer ignore. "Mademoiselle Cole," Poirot said gently, approaching her seat. "May I have a word?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Mr. Poirot, is it true? Has the diamond really disappeared?" "Indeed," Poirot replied, "and I am afraid that the murder of Mr. Fisher is connected to the theft." Vivienne swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "I don't know anything about the diamond, I swear." I've heard of it, of course, who hasn't? But I never imagined it would be on this flight. I'm just a simple woman, travelling to see family in New York. I don't have anything to do with this." Poirot studied her carefully, his eyes softening. He could tell that Vivienne was nervous, but there was something about her reaction that didn't ring true. She was hiding something she was afraid to reveal. "Are you sure about that, Mademoiselle Cole? You were speaking with Mr. Byrne earlier, and you seem to know more than you're letting on." Her eyes darted nervously to the side, and for a fleeting moment Poirot saw the tiniest flicker of guilt pass across her face. She quickly looked away, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I told you, I don't know anything," she repeated, her voice shaking. Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice calm yet insistent. "Perhaps, Mademoiselle Cole, you don't realize how much you do know. You were nervous during your conversation with Mr. Byrne. Too nervous. It's as if you were trying to hide something. Tell me, did you know that Fisher was carrying the Star of Carthage on this flight?" Vivienne's eyes widened in shock, and she took a sharp breath. How do you know that?" Poirot smiled thinly. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, Mademoiselle Cole. But I will not pressure you. The truth will come out in time." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her lap. Poirot could see the wheels turning in her mind, and he knew that there was more to her story than she was willing to admit. Poirot's mind churned as he moved through the cabin, speaking with the other passengers and analyzing their behavior. The theft of the diamond had thrown a wrench into his investigation, but Poirot knew it was not the end of the road. It was merely the beginning. Each conversation, each passing moment, brought him closer to the truth. He could feel the web of lies closing in around him, and he would not rest until he had untangled it completely. There was one thing Poirot was certain of. The murderer was still aboard the plane. The question was not who had committed the crime. It was why, and who stood to gain the most from both Fisher's death and the stolen diamond. And as Poirot took his seat and continued his observations, he knew that the final pieces of the puzzle were just within reach. But they were still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. Secrets and Lies. The Crosland Airways. Concorde was gliding through the sky, the hum of the engines a constant presence, but inside, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. The disappearance of the Star of Carthage and the murder of Gordon Fisher had created an invisible tension that permeated every corner of the cabin. Every passenger was under suspicion, and yet the web of lies, half-truths, and contradictions continued to grow more complicated. Hercule Poirot stood by the galley, looking out through the small window, his mind running over everything he had learned so far. The clues were there. He could feel them, like faint whispers calling him in the right direction. But they were scattered, elusive. He knew the truth was hidden beneath layers of deceit, waiting to be uncovered. But the passengers aboard this plane were keeping their cards close to their chests. Poirot's first priority was to speak with the Burnetts again. After his brief but pointed conversation with Richard Burnett, Poirot had noticed something in the man's behavior, something more than just guilt, more than just the fear of being caught. There was an underlying strain in his marriage, an unspoken tension between him and his wife, Hilda Burnett. They were both hiding something, and Poirot suspected that what they were hiding was connected to Fisher, and perhaps to the Star of Carthage as well. Richard Burnett was seated in his compartment, staring out the window. His brow furrowed, his hand nervously adjusting his cufflinks as though they were the only thing that could steady him. When Poirot entered the compartment, Richard straightened up, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Poirot," Richard greeted him, but there was no warmth in his tone, only a brittle politeness. "What more can I help you with?" Poirot took a seat across from him, his gaze fixed on the man's trembling hands. "Ah, Mr. Burnett, you still seem rather uneasy. I wonder, what is it that is weighing on your mind? The murder of Mr. Fisher, yes? Or perhaps something more?" Richard's eyes darted toward the door, and Poirot saw his shoulders stiffen. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered, his voice low and defensive. "I've already told you everything I know. Fisher was a businessman. We had some disagreements, but that's all." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And yet, Mr. Burnett, there is more to the story, is there not? You've been sweating profusely since I spoke with you earlier, and your hands—" Poirot motioned to Richard's clenched fists. "They tremble as though you are on the verge of confessing something." Richard's face reddened, and he sat back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest defensively. "There's nothing to confess. I didn't kill him. I didn't have anything to do with it." Poirot didn't blink. "I never said you did. But I can't help but notice that you've been particularly interested in the Star of Carthage, Mr. Burnett. How strange that you would show such concern for the diamond. You see, I've been thinking about this for some time, and the connection between you and Fisher becomes clearer with each passing moment." Richard's face shifted uneasily. "You're wrong. I don't care about the diamond. I don't care about any of it. But you did care, didn't you? You cared when Fisher threatened to expose certain indiscretions. Perhaps you had far more to lose than you let on." Poirot paused, watching Richard closely. "Tell me, Mr. Burnett, why are you so worried about a business deal gone wrong?" Richard looked away, his voice faltering. I didn't want anyone to know about it. It was a failed venture, a risk that went bad. But it was my fault, not Fisher's. He was the one who wanted to push it further, and when it failed, he said he'd ruin me. He said he would expose everything." Poirot leaned in. "And the Star of Carthage, Mr. Burnett? Is it possible that Fisher's interest in the diamond had something to do with his attempt to extort you?" Richard swallowed hard, his face drained of colour, and for a moment Poirot could see a flicker of fear in his eyes. The fear wasn't about the murder itself, it was the fear of what might be uncovered. "You need to leave me alone," Richard snapped, standing abruptly. "I have nothing more to say." Poirot remained seated, his voice calm and measured. "I think you do, Mr. Burnett. But I will leave you to your thoughts for now. However, I suggest you think very carefully about how much you have revealed." Richard didn't respond. He turned his back on Poirot, refusing to meet his gaze. Poirot then moved on to Hilda Burnett. Hilda had been in the main cabin earlier, sitting quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had been the picture of composure, perhaps too composed. Poirot knew that beneath her calm exterior there was something more. The way she had reacted when he mentioned her past with Fisher, the sudden defensiveness, the slight tremor in her voice, was telling. He found her seated near the window, her eyes distant as she gazed out into the endless expanse of clouds. She didn't look up when Poirot approached, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible shift in her posture when she realized he was there. "Mademoiselle Burnett," Poirot greeted her. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Hilda didn't immediately respond. She took a deep breath and then slowly turned her head to face him. "I suppose there's no escaping this," she said softly, her voice cool but with an edge of weariness. "What do you want to know now, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot sat across from her, observing her carefully. "I wonder, Mademoiselle Burnett, what you know about the missing star of Carthage. I have reason to believe that you were well aware of its presence on this flight." Hilda's eyes narrowed slightly, and she folded her arms over her chest. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The diamond was being transported for a private collector, wasn't it? Why would I know anything about it?" Poirot smiled slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Ah, but you see, mademoiselle, I believe you do know something about it. You were intimately involved with Fisher many years ago. That much I already know. But it's what you're not telling me that concerns me." Hilda's expression hardened. "I've already told you everything. There was nothing more between us than a brief affair, long before I met Richard. It was over before I even married him." Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Perhaps. But tell me this, mademoiselle. Why did your husband become so agitated when I mentioned Fisher's name? Why does he seem so nervous?" Hilda's lips tightened, and for a moment Poirot saw the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but then closed it again, pressing her lips into a thin line. "It's nothing," she finally said. "Nothing more than an old business deal gone wrong." Poirot didn't buy it. There was more. There had to be. But Hilda refused to divulge any more information. She simply stared out the window, her silence more telling than words ever could be. Poirot left her compartment and walked back down the aisle, lost in thought. He was starting to piece together a picture, but it was still incomplete. Richard's lies about his relationship with Fisher, Hilda's evasiveness, and the strange connection between Barn and Vivian Cole. Everything was intertwined, and yet the connections didn't quite make sense. Then, as he passed by the galley, a thought occurred to him, one that made his stomach tighten. What if the Star of Carthage wasn't just a matter of wealth? What if it was something far more personal? What if the theft wasn't about greed but about control? And what if the murderer knew that the diamond could give them the upper hand, a tool to secure their future, or perhaps destroy someone else's? Poirot's mind raced with possibilities. The killer was still among them, and as much as the passengers were trying to keep their secrets hidden, Poirot was certain that the truth would come to light soon enough. Chapter 6. Unlikely Suspects. The plane continued its journey, the endless stretch of sky outside unchanging, indifferent to the tension inside the cabin. Hercule Poirot sat quietly in his seat, his eyes scanning the passengers as they shifted uncomfortably in their own. The stolen Star of Carthage and the murder of Gordon Fisher had turned the flight into a veritable labyrinth of lies and half-truths, and Poirot was intent on finding the truth hidden within the web of deceit. The more he spoke with the passengers, the more their motives and secrets tangled, leaving him with more questions than answers. Richard Burnett had shown signs of guilt, but there were cracks in his story. Hilda Burnett was calm, but her defensiveness hinted at something buried deep beneath the surface. Marcus Byrne, with his polished exterior, seemed to be hiding far more than he let on. And then there was Vivian Cole, whose nervousness had evolved into something much more calculated. The questions piled up, but every answer was elusive. Poirot knew that the killer was among them. It was simply a matter of finding who and why. Poirot began with Marcus Byrne. The man had been so eager to point the finger at others, to act as if he was above it all. There was a coldness to him, a certain detachment from the emotions that were clearly affecting the others. It was almost as if he was too calm. In Poirot's experience, this kind of behavior often pointed to a person who had something to hide. Byrne had been seated in the rear of the plane, and Poirot found him again in the same position, sitting back, his arms crossed, staring out the window. As Poirot approached, Byrne didn't turn, but his eyes briefly flicked to the side, acknowledging the detective's presence without words. "Mr. Byrne," Poirot began, his voice firm but gentle. "It seems you have been remarkably calm throughout all this. Given the gravity of the situation, I must say that it is unusual. I wonder, Mr. Byrne, why is that?" Byrne's lips curved into a thin smile. "I'm not one to make a scene, Poirot. I've been in difficult situations before, and I've learned to keep my composure. That's what you would call experience, I suppose." "Ah, experience," Poirot repeated, a slight smile on his lips. "Experience in what, may I ask?" Byrne's expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened. "Business. I've been in finance for a long time. The world of money is never without its risks." Poirot moved a little closer, but not too close. He wanted Byrne to feel the weight of his presence, to feel the pressure. "Ah, yes, business. But tell me, Mr. Byrne, you seem so familiar with Fisher's affairs. It was you who first mentioned his financial dealings, and you who seem to know so much about the diamond, before it was even mentioned in this cabin. What is it that you're not telling me?" Byrne's jaw tightened slightly, and Poirot saw the muscles in his neck contract. He was suppressing something, an emotion, a thought, something that had triggered an instinctive reaction. "I'm a businessman, Poirot," Byrne said again, his voice steady, but there was a hard edge to it now. "I know things. I'm not involved in this mess. Fisher's death has nothing to do with me." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "I wonder. You see, I think it has everything to do with you, Mr. Byrne. You were, after all, one of the last people to speak with Fisher, weren't you? You both had dealings, shall we say. And from what I've gathered, Fisher had no qualms about using extreme measures to get what he wanted. Was it really just business between the two of you? Or was there something more personal?" Byrne's eyes flickered, and Poirot caught the brief flash of something dark in his expression, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I told you," Byrne replied, his voice tinged with annoyance. "I had no reason to kill Fisher." "You're grasping at straws," Poirot smiled thinly. "Perhaps. But let me tell you this, Mr. Byrne. The truth has a way of catching up with those who try to hide it. Sooner or later, it will come out. It always does." With that, Poirot turned away, leaving Byrne staring out the window once again, but Poirot could see the slight trembling of his hands as they gripped the armrest. Next, Poirot sought out Vivienne Cole. She was seated near the middle of the plane, her eyes still wide with fear. The nerves that had initially seemed genuine now appeared more like a well-rehearsed act. She was too nervous, too fidgety, and too eager to appear as though she were a victim in this scenario. Poirot had seen people like her before, those who wore their distress like a mask, hiding something darker underneath. When he approached, Vivienne's eyes locked onto him, and she quickly stood up, as though she were desperate to be somewhere else. But Poirot had already anticipated her move and stepped in front of her before she could pass. "Mademoiselle Cole," Poirot said softly, "I wonder, what is it that you are hiding from me?" Vivienne stopped in her tracks, and for the first time, her expression shifted. There was a flicker of something. Guilt. Fear. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by the same shaky, panicked expression she had worn when the murder was first discovered. "I told you, Mr. Poirot," Vivienne stammered, her voice trembling. I don't know anything about the murder or the diamond. I'm just a passenger on this flight. I don't belong in all of this. Poirot studied her carefully. Her words, though sincere sounding, didn't match her body language. Her hands were still clutched tightly around her purse, her knuckles white. She shifted from foot to foot, unable to stay still. The signs of anxiety were undeniable, but were they signs of guilt as well? You see, Mademoiselle Cole, Poirot said gently, there are many things I do not yet understand. For instance, why, just earlier, were you so engaged in conversation with Mr. Byrne? You seemed far more familiar with him than one would expect for two people who had only just met. Vivian's face paled, and she quickly looked away. I was just asking him about his investments. I've heard of him, of course. He's very successful. Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice low. Ah, but I think there is more to it than that. You knew about the Star of Carthage, didn't you? You knew that it was aboard this flight. Perhaps you knew even more about it than you are willing to admit. You were asking Mr. Byrne about it, weren't you? Vivian swallowed, her lips trembling as she struggled to maintain composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, just leave me alone. Poirot straightened up, his mind churning with the implications of her words. Very well, mademoiselle. I will leave you to think, but know this. You're not fooling me. You may try to mask your fear, but I can see through it. You're hiding something, and I will find out what. Vivian stood silent, her eyes still wide with fear. Poirot turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the cabin, her face a mask of confusion and anxiety. Poirot then focused his thoughts on Hilda Burnett. Hilda had been an enigma ever since the beginning. She had been composed, too composed for someone who had just witnessed a murder. She had answered his questions, but her answers always seemed to be carefully guarded, as if she were hiding something important. The affair with Fisher was one thing, but there was something more. Something that Poirot had yet to uncover. He found her in the main cabin, her gaze fixed on the far end of the plane. She was lost in thought, but Poirot could sense that she wasn't as calm as she appeared. There was a crack in her composure, and Poirot was determined to find it. Mademoiselle Burnett. Poirot greeted her softly, but firmly. She turned to face him, and for the first time Poirot saw something break through her cool exterior, a flash of vulnerability. Yes, Mr. Poirot, she asked, her voice steady, but there was a hint of tension in it now. I need to know more about your husband's involvement with Fisher, mademoiselle. I have reason to believe that you know far more than you have let on. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. I've already told you everything, Mr. Poirot. There is nothing more to say. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. Mademoiselle, you are not fooling me. There are cracks in your story, small things that don't add up. I can see that you are hiding something. Hilda's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. She hesitated before answering. I don't want to hurt Richard. You don't understand. He's been under so much stress lately. I never wanted him to get involved with Fisher. It was his mistake, not mine. Poirot watched her closely. But you, Mademoiselle Burnett, are not entirely innocent in all of this. You knew of the diamond's existence, didn't you? And you knew of Fisher's intentions as well. Hilda's eyes flickered, and Poirot saw the briefest flash of fear. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was supposed to be over. The affair, the business dealings. Everything. Poirot nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. "It is never just over, Mademoiselle Burnett. These things have a way of coming back to haunt us." With that, he turned away, his mind heavy with the tangled web of deceit that was beginning to reveal itself. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many motives still hidden behind lies. But Poirot was certain of one thing. The truth was coming, piece by piece, by Chapter 7. A Clue in Plain Sight. The flight continued its steady course through the endless expanse of the sky, yet for Hercule Poirot, the journey had turned into a race against time. The murder of Gordon Fisher, the disappearance of the Star of Carthage, and the tangled web of lies spun by the passengers had him no closer to the truth. Each person had their secrets, each statement had its contradictions, and every clue seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Poirot had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to see the things they weren't saying, to understand the lies they told themselves. And yet, despite his sharp observations, he still felt a growing unease. The passengers aboard this flight had their stories, their motives, and their alibis. But there was something that didn't fit, something lurking just beneath the surface. Poirot began his day with a quiet, careful examination of Fisher's body once more. He had already spoken to the crew and secured the crime scene, but there were still details to uncover. The absence of blood on Fisher's clothing, the unusual lack of struggle, and the strange way in which the knife had been used, all of these things gnawed at him. And yet, none of it added up. Returning to the place where Fisher had been found, Poirot crouched down again, his eyes scanning every inch of the seat, the surrounding area, and the body itself. The knife, a sleek silver penknife, was still lodged in Fisher's chest, but the lack of blood suggested that the killer had been precise, methodical. The body showed no signs of being moved. It had been placed in the seat with deliberate care. There had been no panic, no hurried escape. It was as though the murderer had expected to be undisturbed, that they would have all the time they needed. Poirot's mind ticked. The situation was unlike most murders. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about a violent outburst. This was calculated, well planned. But why? And how had the killer known that Fisher would be alone, that no one would interrupt? As Poirot continued his inspection, his eyes fell upon a small, nearly imperceptible detail, a scrap of paper wedged in Fisher's jacket pocket. He retrieved it carefully, unfolding it with precision. It was a small, yellowed piece of stationery with a few hastily scrawled words in a cramped hand. The ink was faint, but the message was clear enough. "Meet me at 2:00. We'll settle everything. The diamond is ready." Poirot's brow furrowed. The diamond. This message confirmed what he had suspected all along. The murder and the theft were linked. But there was more. The message hinted at an arrangement between Fisher and someone else, someone with a vested interest in the diamond. The time was clear, 2:00. But what was meant by settle everything? Was Fisher planning to sell the diamond? Or had he been blackmailing someone into giving it to him? Poirot tucked the note into his pocket and stood up, his mind racing. He needed to speak with Byrne again. Poirot found Marcus Byrne near the front of the cabin, casually flipping through a magazine, though his eyes didn't seem to be focused on the pages. When Poirot approached, Byrne looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Poirot." Back for another round of questioning, I see Poirot didn't smile. "Indeed, Mr. Byrne. I have just come from examining Fisher's body once again, and I've uncovered something interesting." Byrne raised an eyebrow, putting down his magazine. "Oh? What is it?" "The Star of Carthage, it seems, is not the only thing Fisher was involved with. I found a note on his person. A note that suggests he was meeting someone who intended to settle everything. The message mentioned the diamond, Mr. Byrne. I believe you are aware of what that means. Byrne's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tightening around his jaw. And what exactly does that mean, Poirot? Poirot took a step closer, his voice low but firm. It means that Fisher had made arrangements with someone, and it's likely that this someone had something to do with his death. I wonder, Mr. Byrne, could it have been you? Byrne's eyes flickered for a moment and Poirot caught it. A flash of fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual mask of cool indifference. I've already told you, Poirot, I have nothing to do with Fisher's murder. I'm not involved in whatever dealings he had with the diamond. That's a matter for the authorities, not for me. Poirot studied him, his eyes narrowing. I disagree, Mr. Byrne. You see, I believe that Fisher was blackmailing someone, and I believe that you were part of those dealings. You were so eager to talk to Mademoiselle Cole earlier, weren't you? You had an interest in the diamond, just like Fisher. But it's not just business, is it? Byrne's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no warmth behind it. You're quite the detective, Poirot. You've got me all figured out, haven't you? Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he observed Byrne carefully, noting the subtle tension in his posture, the way his fingers twitched slightly at his side. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Poirot to know he was on the right track. I think, Poirot said slowly, that you are hiding something, Mr. Byrne. You were involved with Fisher's dealings, and I believe you knew that the Star of Carthage was here on this plane. I also believe that you're trying very hard to distance yourself from all of this, but that won't work. Not for long. Byrne's eyes grew hard, and for a moment, Poirot thought he saw something flash behind them, something like regret. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by a cold mask of indifference. I'm not the one you should be concerned about, Poirot, Byrne said quietly. You're looking in the wrong direction. Maybe you should focus on someone else. Poirot tilted his head, intrigued. Someone else, you say? Who? Byrne's lips tightened, but he said nothing more. Poirot knew that he had pushed the man as far as he would go for now. He would need to return to him later, when the time was right. Poirot's thoughts turned next to Vivienne Cole. She had been, from the very beginning, a woman of contradictions. Nervous, yes, but also composed at times. Too composed, in fact, for someone so apparently frightened. Her behavior, her quick glances, her whispered words with Byrne, there was more going on there than she was willing to admit. Poirot found her seated near the back of the cabin once more. Her eyes were fixed on her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. As he approached, she looked up, her expression immediately shifting to one of fear. Mademoiselle Cole, Poirot began gently, I must ask you once more to be truthful with me. I have evidence that suggests you knew more about the Star of Carthage than you've let on. Why did you lie to me earlier? What is it that you are hiding? Vivienne swallowed, her lips trembling as she glanced around the cabin, as though expecting someone to be watching. I don't know anything, she stammered. I swear, I don't. Poirot leaned in, his voice soft but insistent. I believe you do, Mademoiselle Cole. You were involved with Byrne, weren't you? And you knew Fisher. You knew about the diamond. You knew it was on this flight. Tell me, Mademoiselle Cole, why are you afraid? She flinched at the question, and for the first time, her composure cracked. She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as she fought to maintain control. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. But Byrne, he made me do it. He said I had to help him get the diamond, that it would all be over once we had it." Poirot's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. Vivian Cole had been manipulated, coerced, into helping Byrne with his scheme. But she hadn't been the mastermind. Byrne had been. And now Fisher was dead, the diamond was gone, and Vivian was left to pick up the pieces of a life she could no longer control. "Did you know that Fisher was planning to double-cross Byrne?" Poirot asked softly, his voice filled with understanding. "Did you know that Byrne was not the only one who stood to gain from the Star of Carthage?" Vivian nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, I knew. I didn't want to be a part of it, but Byrne threatened me. He said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me." Poirot's expression softened. "You are not the one to blame, Mademoiselle Cole. But you must help me now. Tell me everything you know, and together we will make sure that justice is served." As Vivian began to recount what she knew, Poirot's mind raced with the new revelations. The diamond, the murder, Byrne's manipulation, all of it was starting to come together. But the truth was still just out of reach, hidden in the dark corners of their lies and half-truths. One thing was certain, though. The game was far from over, and Poirot was closing in on the killer. The final pieces were almost in place. Chapter 8. The Final Hours. The atmosphere inside the Crossland Airways Concorde had become suffocating. Time was slipping away with every passing minute, and Hercule Poirot felt the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. The murder of Gordon Fisher, the missing Star of Carthage, and the increasingly complicated web of lies and deception had stretched him thin. Every passenger was a suspect, each hiding their own secrets, and yet the closer Poirot came to the truth, the more elusive it became. With the plane nearing its descent into New York, Poirot knew that he had only a few more hours, perhaps even less, to unravel the mystery. There were still so many questions, so many pieces that didn't quite fit, and the tension in the cabin was palpable as the passengers waited for the investigation to reach its conclusion. Poirot's mind turned back to Richard Burnett. The man had been behaving increasingly erratically. At first he had seemed simply nervous, but as Poirot had spoken with him more, it became clear that Richard was hiding something deeper, something connected to Fisher's death, and perhaps to the missing diamond. Richard's previous outbursts had been understandable, even expected, but his behavior had become more erratic as the investigation wore on. There was a breaking point, a moment when Poirot knew that Richard would crack. It was only a matter of time. Poirot found Richard Burnett standing near the back of the plane, his eyes darting nervously between the other passengers. His posture was tense, his shoulders hunched as though he were trying to shrink into himself. When Richard saw Poirot approaching, he stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. "Mr. Poirot," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "I don't know how much longer I can take this. I've told you everything I know, but it's like you're not hearing me." I didn't kill Fisher. Poirot studied him carefully, noting the raw fear in his eyes. There was something more here, something that Richard had yet to admit. "You are under pressure, Mr. Burnett. But it is not just Fisher's murder that concerns me. It is the missing diamond, the Star of Carthage, and it is your connection to both that troubles me." Richard's face grew pale, his lips trembling. He quickly glanced around the cabin as though searching for an escape. "I don't know where the diamond is. I didn't take it. Fisher, He had his own plans. He was going to double-cross me. He threatened to expose everything. The deal, the mess I was in. Poirot took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Richard's face. Yes, Mr. Burnett. The business dealings, the failed investments, the blackmail. But that is not the full story, is it? There is something more. You were involved in Fisher's murder. Perhaps not directly, but you were complicit in something. Richard took a step back, his face crumpling in panic. No, you're wrong. I didn't kill him, I swear. I didn't kill anyone. Poirot's voice softened. Then why the anxiety? Why the sweating? Why do you act like a man cornered, Mr. Burnett? You say you didn't kill him, but there is more to this story than you're letting on. Richard's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked defeated. I didn't want to, Poirot. I didn't want to be involved. But Fisher was a threat, a real threat. He knew too much about my dealings, about everything I had worked to hide. And then he started demanding more, asking for more than just money. He wanted the diamond. He said he would expose me unless I gave it to him. Poirot's expression hardened. And did you? Did you give Fisher the diamond? Richard's eyes shifted away, his voice quiet. I didn't know what to do, but I wasn't the only one who wanted to get rid of Fisher. Poirot turned his attention to Hilda Burnett. The events surrounding her husband's behavior had been strange, but her own role in the mystery was just as perplexing. Hilda had kept her composure throughout the entire investigation, but Poirot could see the cracks in her stoic demeanor. She was a woman struggling to hide her guilt, her fear. There was something else beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling him. Poirot found her near the galley, staring out the window, her face half-shadowed in the dim cabin light. She looked weary, her eyes distant. As he approached, she turned to face him, her lips pressed together tightly. Mademoiselle Burnett, Poirot began gently, you've been rather quiet lately. I wonder, what is it that you're hiding? Hilda didn't answer immediately, her eyes flicking nervously toward Richard, who was still talking with a flight attendant. She took a deep breath before speaking. I've told you everything, Poirot, she said quietly. There is nothing more to say. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. You were once involved with Fisher, were you not? You and your husband, you both had secrets. And those secrets have a way of coming back, Mademoiselle Burnett. You cannot hide from them forever. Hilda's face twisted in pain, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. It was a long time ago, she whispered, before Richard. Before everything. Poirot waited, giving her time to gather her thoughts. I know. But what I also know is that Fisher held something over you. That much is clear. It's why he became a threat to both you and your husband. But what I don't understand, Mademoiselle Burnett, is why you remain so silent. Why not tell me everything? Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked up at him, her face filled with anguish. I never wanted any of this. I didn't want to be involved, but Fisher was threatening Richard, and I couldn't let that happen. I wanted to end it before it got worse. Poirot's voice softened. You are protecting him, aren't you? Your husband. Hilda nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. He doesn't deserve this. He's been under so much pressure. I didn't want to see him fall apart. I couldn't bear it. So She stopped, choking on her words, her hands trembling as she clutched her arms. Poirot stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You didn't want your husband to go down for something he didn't do, Poirot said softly. But your silence is not helping him. You need to tell me everything, Mademoiselle Burnett. Only then can I help you both." Hilda shook her head, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't supposed to go this far. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Poirot knew that time was running out. The final pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the truth was still just out of reach. The Star of Carthage, the murder of Fisher, the involvement of Byrne, Vivian Cole, and the Burnetts. Everything was entwined in a complex web of lies and half-truths. But the truth was out there, and Poirot was closer than ever to uncovering it. The question now was how far the passengers aboard the Crosland Airways Concorde were willing to go to protect their secrets. Would they crack under the pressure, or would Poirot need to make his final move before the plane landed in New York? As Poirot sat back in his seat, the realization hit him like a sudden wave. One final crucial clue was missing. The time was coming, and everything he had gathered pointed to a shocking conclusion. He only had a few hours left to uncover it all, to confront the killer, and to bring the truth to light. The final confrontation was drawing near. The Star of Carthage was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It was the key to understanding everything that had happened on this flight. And Poirot was ready to solve the case, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. The Unmasking. The Crosland Airways. Concorde had begun its descent into New York, and Hercule Poirot stood in the aisle, feeling the subtle shift in the air as the passengers began to stir. The steady hum of the engines seemed quieter now, and the familiar rhythm of the flight had been replaced with a palpable tension, a collective awareness that the end was near. The murderer was still on board. The missing Star of Carthage remained unaccounted for, and the web of lies had only deepened as the hours wore on. But Poirot knew it was time to bring everything to light. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, Poirot's mind was already racing. The last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Only now did the full scope of the mystery reveal itself. He had uncovered the motives, the lies, and the connections. But there was one final confrontation left, one final unmasking of the truth. Poirot stood before the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. They were all here. Richard Burnett, his face pale and drawn. Hilda Burnett, who had cried herself dry. Marcus Byrne, who exuded the same calm indifference he had maintained throughout the flight. And Vivian Cole, who had finally admitted to her role in the events that had unfolded. But there was something else, a single, undeniable truth that tied them all together. Poirot stood in front of the cabin, facing the passengers, who were now watching him in silent anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and commanding, "the time has come to reveal the truth. For too long you have hidden your secrets, and for too long you have lived in the shadows of your lies. But no longer." He paused, letting his words sink in. The passengers remained still, their eyes locked on him, their faces a mixture of anxiety, curiosity, and dread. Poirot could see the guilt and fear in their expressions. He knew they were all wondering who would be exposed, who would be unmasked. "Earlier today, a murder occurred on this flight," Poirot continued, his voice steady. "And with that murder came the disappearance of the Star of Carthage, a diamond worth millions. But the truth is far more complex than that. It's not just about the diamond. It's about greed, power, and the lengths you would all go to protect your secrets." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over them all. "You see, each of you had a motive, but only one of you had the means, the opportunity, and the desire to commit this crime." Poirot paused again, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he pointed directly at Richard Burnett. "You, Mr. Burnett," Poirot said, his voice quiet but piercing. "You are the one who killed Gordon Fisher." The cabin erupted into murmurs. Richard's face went white as a sheet, his mouth opening and closing as if to say something, but no words came out. He stood frozen, unable to move or speak. "I know what you are thinking, Mr. Burnett," Poirot continued, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You think you're innocent, that you're not responsible. But that, my friend, is where you are wrong. You are guilty, not only of murder, but of a crime that reaches far beyond Fisher's death." Richard's breath hitched, his body trembling with the realization that Poirot had unraveled the mystery. I didn't kill him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he whispered. Poirot took a step closer, his voice low but filled with authority. "No, Mr. Burnett. You didn't kill him out of anger or malice. You killed him out of desperation. Fisher had threatened to expose you, your financial dealings, your failing business, and the lies you built your wealth upon. You were desperate, and when you learned that he had become involved with Byrne, that he was planning to take the Star of Carthage from you, you saw no other way out. You murdered him to protect yourself." Richard's hands shook, his lips quivering. "No, I didn't." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "You did, Mr. Burnett. You were the one who killed Fisher, but you didn't act alone." He turned his gaze toward Marcus Byrne. "You, Mr. Byrne, you were the mastermind behind the theft of the Star of Carthage. You had been using Fisher to secure the diamond, all the while planning to steal it for yourself. You had threatened Vivian into helping you, and you used her as an unwilling accomplice." Byrne's face tightened, but he said nothing. He had been caught, and he knew it. "Mr. Byrne, you had your eye on the diamond from the beginning," Poirot said, his voice growing colder. "You were well aware of its value, and you knew that Fisher would eventually try to double-cross you. You saw Fisher as a threat, a pawn in your game, and so you orchestrated his murder to take the diamond for yourself. But you underestimated the depths of your involvement. You were too greedy, too reckless. You made one mistake too many." Mr. Byrne clenched his fists, his face turning red with anger. "You're wrong, Poirot. I didn't kill him. It was Burnett. He was the one who wanted Fisher out of the picture. I just wanted the diamond." Poirot's gaze grew colder. "You both wanted the diamond, Mr. Byrne. But Fisher was the one who stood in your way. You played a dangerous game, and you lost." He turned his attention back to Vivian Cole. "And you, Mademoiselle Cole, you were caught in the web of deceit spun by these two men. You were manipulated by Byrne, forced to help him in exchange for promises of protection. You didn't want to be part of the plan, but you were too frightened to refuse. In the end, you were a pawn in their scheme, but not the mastermind." Vivian's face was pale, and she looked down at her hands, guilt and shame written all over her. I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. Poirot's voice softened. "You didn't kill anyone, Mademoiselle Cole. But you were complicit, and that is why you must be held accountable, just as the others must." As the passengers sat in stunned silence, Poirot looked around the cabin one last time. "I know that this is not the ending you expected, but it is the truth nonetheless. Richard Burnett killed Gordon Fisher, but he was not alone. Marcus Byrne was the true mastermind behind the diamond theft, and Vivian Cole was coerced into helping them. You are all guilty in one way or another, but you are also the ones who will pay the price for what you've done." He paused, watching the faces of those before him, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, fear, and acceptance. "Justice will be served," Poirot added softly, his voice carrying the weight of his final words. "But it is up to you to decide how you will face the consequences of your actions." The cabin was still, the only sound the faint hum of the plane as it continued its descent. Poirot stepped back, his eyes scanning the faces of those who would soon be held accountable for their roles in the crime. He had unraveled the truth, pieced together the lies, and exposed the culprits. But as the plane made its final approach, Poirot's mind was already turning to the next mystery, for he knew that in the world of crime, there would always be another puzzle to solve, another case to crack, and he would be there, waiting for the next challenge. As the plane touched down in New York, Poirot felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The case had been solved, the truth revealed. The Star of Carthage would soon be recovered, and the passengers who had committed murder and theft would face their fate. But for now, Hercule Poirot allowed himself one final glance at the horizon as the plane taxied toward the gate, knowing that his work was done, at least for today. Chapter 10. The Shocking Twist. The Crosland Airways. Concorde had finally touched down in New York, its wheels gently scraping the runway as the cabin exhaled a collective breath. The hum of the engines had faded to a low murmur, replaced by the anxious whispers of the passengers. Despite the plane's smooth landing, the atmosphere was thick with the tension of Poirot's revelations. As the plane taxied to its gate, Hercule Poirot remained seated, his sharp eyes scanning the room one last time. The passengers, once confident and composed, now looked small in their guilt. They had all been exposed. And yet, Poirot knew that, while they had confessed their crimes in the eyes of the law, there was one more truth yet to be unearthed. The Burnetts, Byrne and Vivian Cole were all under arrest now, their roles in the murder of Gordon Fisher and the theft of the Star of Carthage fully uncovered. The authorities would take over, and justice would be served. But there was something more. Poirot felt it like a whisper in his ear, something that lingered just beyond the horizon of his deductions. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark, Poirot rose from his seat with quiet deliberation. He had one more conversation to have, one last piece of the puzzle to confirm. Poirot made his way down the aisle, passing by the still ashen faces of the passengers. There was Richard Burnett, his face pale, hands still shaking, as though the truth had finally broken through his defenses. His wife, Hilda Burnett, sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. They had been exposed as accomplices, but the full scope of their involvement was more complicated than anyone had imagined. Barnes was sitting with his head down, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked like a man who had lost everything. But Poirot knew that Burns' calm facade had been his only protection. The diamond was gone, but he had been caught in his own web of ambition and greed. Vivian Cole, standing at the back of the plane, looked as though she might collapse from the weight of it all. She had been manipulated and coerced, and now she was left to face the consequences of her involvement. Poirot walked up to the flight attendant at the front of the cabin, who was speaking with the pilot about the arrival procedures. He had to make one last request. As the attendant turned to him, Poirot leaned in and spoke in a low, measured voice. "I need to speak to the authorities before we disembark," he said. "There is something I must confirm with them, something very important." The attendant nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She quickly relayed the message to the captain, who confirmed that he would coordinate with the authorities as soon as the plane was parked at the gate. Poirot took his seat again, but this time his mind was focused not on the suspects, but on something else entirely. The plane slowly came to a stop at the gate, and the passengers stood, collecting their belongings. The doors opened, and the first of the flight attendants stepped into the aisle to prepare for the disembarkation. but Poirot's eyes remained fixed on one person, seated in the middle of the cabin. He watched as Marcus Byrne stood up, his movements slow but purposeful. A flicker of something passed through the man's eyes, a flash of realization, a hint of surprise. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Poirot knew that it was the final clue, the twist that had eluded him until now. As Byrne moved toward the exit, Poirot stood up suddenly, stepping into the aisle in front of him. The people behind him hesitated, confused by the interruption. Byrne looked up, startled, as Poirot blocked his path. "Mr. Byrne," Poirot said softly, his voice steady and calm. "There is one final matter I need to address." Byrne's expression tightened, and he took a step back. "What now, Poirot? Haven't you already said everything you need to say?" Poirot smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You see, Mr. Byrne, you made a mistake. A crucial one. You thought you had hidden your tracks, that you had concealed your involvement in everything. But there was something you overlooked." Byrne's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Poirot's eyes never left his, and in that moment, he knew that the final revelation was about to unfold. "You see, Mr. Byrne, it wasn't just the Star of Carthage that you wanted to steal. It was something far more valuable. The diamond was a means to an end, but it wasn't the only thing you were after." Byrne's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he seemed almost unsure of himself. "You're wrong, Poirot," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't want anything more than what I got." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Byrne. You were not the only one who wanted the diamond, and you were not the only one involved in this whole scheme." Byrne's face paled as the realization hit him. His mouth went dry, and for the first time, his confidence cracked. Poirot watched the shift in his expression, the fear creeping into his eyes. "Fisher knew something," Poirot continued. "He knew more than he let on, didn't he? He had information that you didn't want to get out. The diamond wasn't just an artifact, it was a key to something you had been hiding for years." Byrne took an involuntary step backward. No, that's not possible." Poirot smiled, but it was a smile filled with quiet triumph. "It is possible, Mr. Byrne. And now, the truth is clear." Suddenly, the door to the cockpit opened, and a group of police officers entered the cabin. They moved swiftly, their eyes scanning the passengers, but it was clear they were here for one purpose only: to arrest Marcus Byrne. Poirot turned back to the passengers, his voice calm as he addressed them one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that the true mastermind behind Fisher's murder and the theft of the Star of Carthage has been revealed," Poirot said, his voice ringing out over the stillness. "But the twist, the final twist, is that the diamond itself was never about wealth or fame. It was about silencing someone who knew too much. Marcus Byrne was not just after a diamond. He was after something far more dangerous. Information." Byrne's face twisted in fury, but the officers quickly restrained him, ushering him toward the exit. He struggled, but it was clear that his fate had been sealed. His plans had unraveled, and the truth had come out. Poirot looked at the remaining passengers, his voice softening. "There is one final lesson here, I believe. The truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, always finds a way to the surface. No lie, no scheme, can hide it forever. The Star of Carthage may have been the object of obsession, but it was the truth that led us here today." As the authorities took Byrne away, the passengers slowly began to disembark, some in silence, others murmuring in disbelief. Poirot remained seated, watching them go, his mind already turning to the next mystery, the next puzzle to solve. The Star of Carthage would soon be recovered, the case would soon be closed, and justice would be served. But Poirot's work was never truly finished. In every mystery, there were always new questions, new secrets to uncover. For Poirot, the journey would never end. It was simply the nature of his work. As the last of the passengers exited the plane, Poirot stood up and adjusted his coat. He gave one last look around the cabin, satisfied that the truth had been revealed, before stepping into the world beyond. The puzzle was complete, the mystery solved, and Poirot knew with a quiet certainty that the next one was already waiting for him. And so, with his characteristic grace, Hercule Poirot walked off the Crosland Airways Concorde, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead.